The marketplace was alive with noise and colors. Merchants shouted about their goods. Alien spices filled the air with strange smells, and children weaved between stalls chasing each other. But then the shouting changed. It was no longer about selling or buying. Angry voices rose together, sharp and accusing. In the middle of the square, a small alien girl stood frozen, clutching a piece of fruit in her trembling hands. Her clothes were torn, her face thin with hunger, and her large eyes darted from one furious face to another. "Thief!" a trader bellowed, pointing a thick finger at her. "She stole from my stall!" His words caught the attention of nearby merchants, and soon others joined in. "Dirty thief!" shouted one. "They always steal!" cried another. The crowd grew restless, pressing closer as the girl backed away, her hands shaking. She tried to speak, her voice breaking, but nobody listened. A stone flew from somewhere in the mob and struck the ground near her feet. She flinched, clutching the fruit tighter against her chest. Guards rushed forward, their armor clanking. The sight of them made the girl's knees weaken. She tried to explain, stammering in a broken voice, but the guards did not care. They moved to seize her, one already pulling out shackles. The marketplace had turned into a trial, and everyone had already decided her guilt. Some cheered as the guards raised their arms to grab her. That was when he saw it. The human stood a little distance away, a stranger in this city of alien faces. He had been walking past, just another traveler passing through, but the scene made him stop. His eyes didn't look at the angry crowd first, nor at the guards. They went straight to the girl. He saw how thin she was, how her knees bent as if she might collapse, how her lips were cracked from thirst. He saw fear, raw, desperate fear, burning in her wide eyes. She wasn't a thief. She was starving. The human stepped forward. His boots struck the stones firmly, cutting through the angry voices. The guards turned to him in surprise as he moved between them and the girl. She stared up at him, not understanding, her chest rising and falling quickly. "Move aside, human," the guard barked. "This creature is a thief. She'll be punished." But he didn't move. He held his ground, standing taller than many around him. The crowd hissed with anger, calling him a fool, mocking his choice. "Why defend a thief?" one shouted. "She's not worth it," another cried. But the human's eyes did not leave the frightened girl clutching her fruit. He could feel her shaking behind him, as though hiding in his shadow. The market master, a broad alien with gold rings on his tusks, stepped forward. "Human, this does not concern you. She stole from my stall. Justice must be served. If you interfere, you will pay the price with her." His voice was thick with authority, and the crowd fell silent, waiting to see what the human would do. The human bent down slowly, reached into his worn coat, and pulled out the small pouch of coins he had left. They clinked faintly, a sound far less than what the wealthy merchants carried, but it was all he had. Without hesitation, he tossed the pouch onto the stall where the fruit had been taken. The coins scattered across the wood, shining under the sun. "Now it is not stolen," he said firmly. His voice was calm but carried through the marketplace. The silence that followed was heavy. Murmurs started to spread through the crowd. Some gasped, some scoffed, others laughed in disbelief. The guard froze, his hand still holding the shackles, uncertain what to do now. The market master's eyes narrowed, greedy fingers already sweeping up the coins. He said nothing. Behind the human, the girl's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she lifted her head. Her wide eyes, still wet with fear, locked on the man who stood in front of her. Nobody had ever done this for her. Nobody had ever chosen to take her side. She whispered something, a sound too soft to hear over the noise of the market, but her lips formed the words clearly, "Thank you." The crowd did not applaud. They did not welcome the human's kindness. Instead, whispers spread like fire. "Madness," someone hissed. "A fool protecting a thief," another sneered. "Just wait, she'll rob him too," muttered a third. The human ignored them. He turned his head slightly and spoke quietly over his shoulder. "Stay behind me." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The market master was satisfied with his coins and waved them off, though his eyes glowed with dislike. The crowd grumbled, but began to disperse, disappointed there would be no punishment, no spectacle of suffering to satisfy their anger. Still, the whisper of distrust lingered in the air, clinging to the girl and to the man who had chosen to defend her. As the square slowly returned to its usual business, the human felt the girl's small hand tug lightly at his sleeve. She clung to him as though afraid he would vanish, as though if she let go, the mob would return to drag her away. He looked down at her and saw not a thief, but a child abandoned by the world, judged only for her weakness. He sighed, knowing already that his choice would not be forgotten by the people around him, but neither would it be forgotten by her. The market smelled again of spices and roasting food, but for the human it was different now. The fruit she still clutched to her chest seemed heavier than gold. He had paid for it with the last of his coins, yet it felt like something far greater had been exchanged. The eyes of the alien girl, once filled with terror, now carried a fragile spark of hope, and he knew at that moment his life had just changed forever. The crowd did not forget what happened in the market that day. Whispers followed the human as he walked through the streets, and every time people looked at him, they shook their heads or spat on the ground. To them, he was the fool who defended a thief, the fool who wasted his money on someone who deserved punishment. The alien girl walked behind him, clutching the fruit to her chest like a treasure, her eyes wide with fear that someone might take it from her. When they reached the edge of the market, 2 guards blocked their path. Their armor gleamed, and their sharp eyes fixed on the human with suspicion. "You interfered with justice," one guard growled, holding out a hand. "You have made yourself responsible for her crime. Pay a fine or come with us." The other guard raised the shackles again, pointing at the girl. "And she belongs to the state now. Step aside, human." The human stood still, his face calm but his voice strong. "I paid already. Her debt is cleared." He pointed back toward the stall where the market master had greedily scooped up his coins. "The fruit is not stolen anymore. She owes you nothing." The guards looked at each other, confused for a moment. The law was strict, but the logic was undeniable. The stall had been paid. Still, their orders were clear, and they stepped forward. The girl let out a frightened gasp, her thin fingers gripping the human's coat tightly. She shook her head again and again, whispering, "Please, don't let them take me." Her voice was soft, trembling, but the human heard every word. He reached down, gently pulling her behind him, shielding her with his body. His eyes locked on the guards. "If you want her," he said slowly, "you will have to go through me." The square fell silent again. Merchants stopped arranging their goods. Shoppers froze mid-step, and the few who had followed to see more of the drama leaned in eagerly. The guards hesitated. They were armed, armored, and trained, but this human did not flinch. His stance was steady, his eyes filled with an unshakable resolve. One of them spat on the ground and muttered, "Fool." They stepped back with a sneer, leaving the human and the girl standing in the middle of the road. The girl's knees gave out, and she collapsed against him. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from terror that had been building inside her for so long. The fruit dropped from her hands and rolled across the stone street. The human knelt down and picked it up, brushing the dust from its skin before placing it back into her trembling hands. "Eat," he said quietly. She hesitated, as though she did not believe she was allowed, but then her hunger broke through her fear. She bit into it, juice running down her chin. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she tasted food. A few people who had gathered snorted and laughed at the sight. "He spends coins for her. Now he feeds her too," one alien muttered. "He's lost his mind." Another shook his head. "She will rob him in his sleep. Wait and see." But the human ignored their words. His eyes stayed on the girl as she devoured the fruit, her small frame trembling with every bite, as if expecting someone to snatch it away. When she finished, her wide eyes lifted again to the man. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why? Why did you do that? No one ever stands for me." The human studied her face for a long moment. "Because you are not a thief," he answered simply. "You are hungry, and no one deserves punishment for hunger." The girl blinked, her lips parting as though she had never heard such words before. She lowered her head, clutching the core of the fruit to her chest, as if it was worth more than gold. The human rose and looked around. People still stared, their eyes cold, their mouths twisted with suspicion. He knew what they saw. To them, the girl was just a criminal, and he was just a fool defending her. But as he looked down at her fragile frame and saw her clutch his coat again like a lifeline, He knew he had done the only thing he could. Later that evening, as they walked away from the busy square, whispers still followed them. Guards at the gates muttered warnings. "Be careful, human. Keep her close, or she'll take everything you own." A merchant passing by sneered. "She's only pretending. You'll regret it." But the human did not answer any of them. His steps were steady, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The girl walked behind him silently, but her every movement showed her fear. She glanced over her shoulder at every corner, expecting the guards to return, expecting stones to fly again, expecting chains to be forced on her wrists. Yet each time she looked forward, she saw the man's back, broad and unyielding, walking without hesitation. And slowly, she began to realize that for as long as she stayed near him, no one could touch her. When they reached a quiet alley, the human finally stopped. He turned to face her. "You can go," he said gently. "You don't have to follow me. The crowd is gone now. You are safe for the night." His words were meant to give her freedom, but her reaction was not what he expected. She shook her head fiercely, clutching his coat again. "No," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "If I leave, they'll find me again. You're the only one who doesn't want me dead." For a moment, the human looked at her, silent, as though weighing the meaning of her words. He had meant only to help for a moment, to end the cruelty in the market. But the girl's desperate grip told him this was not just a moment for her. To her, his act was not small. It was everything. She was alone in a city that wanted her gone. And now she had found the one person who saw her as more than a thief. He sighed, shaking his head at the trouble already following him. "Stay close then," he muttered. "But understand, I can't promise this will be easy." The girl nodded quickly, her large eyes bright with something he had not seen in her before. Hope. She would not let go now. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. For her, the human was no longer just a stranger. He was a shield against a world that hated her. And she had already decided she would never leave his side. The night in the city was never truly dark. Strange lanterns burned with blue fire, and the hum of distant engines carried through the narrow streets. The human walked alone, his coat wrapped tight around him, the sound of his boots echoing softly on the stone path. He thought the day's trouble was over. He had given away his last coins, defended a stranger, and left the crowd behind. Now all he wanted was to find a place to rest his tired body. But then he heard it, the soft scrape of footsteps behind him. At first he ignored it, thinking it was just another traveler, but the sound returned each time he turned a corner. Steady, light, always a few paces behind. He slowed his steps suddenly, and the sound slowed too. His eyes narrowed. Without warning, he spun around. There, in the shadows of the alley, stood the alien girl. Her thin frame was pressed against the wall, her hands clutching the ragged cloth of her clothing. Her wide eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, caught like a frightened animal. She froze as his gaze locked onto her, as though she had been caught stealing again. "You," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why are you following me?" She swallowed hard, her voice cracking as she whispered, I don't know where else to go." Her words were barely louder than the hum of the city. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "You saved me. If I go back, they'll take me. They'll beat me, maybe worse." Her lips trembled and she lowered her head. "Please, don't send me away." The human sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had not asked for this. He had wanted only to stop cruelty in the market, nothing more. Now this girl clung to him like a shadow. He looked at her again, and though he tried to stay cold, her expression cut deep. She was terrified, desperate, yet there was also something else. Trust. A fragile, uncertain trust, placed only in him. "You'll bring me trouble," he said at last. His voice was low, almost tired. "I don't even know your name." She blinked at him, as if surprised that he cared to ask. "Lyra," she said softly. The name lingered in the air like a secret. Then she added, "I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm there. I just don't want to be alone again." For a long moment he studied her. The city around them continued to move, merchants closing stalls, guards patrolling, engines roaring in the distance. Yet in that small alley, it felt like time had stopped. Finally he turned away, his voice flat but not unkind. "Stay if you want, but don't slow me down." The girl's breath caught, and her small shoulders relaxed for the first time. She hurried forward and fell into step behind him, her bare feet making almost no sound. She kept her promise. She was quiet, careful, almost invisible. But though she said nothing, her eyes followed his every move, as though memorizing him. They walked through the city together, though only one of them had chosen it. The human glanced back once, seeing her shadow just a step behind. She moved quickly when he moved, stopped when he stopped, always keeping that small distance but never letting it grow. At first, it felt strange, but as the minutes passed, he grew used to it, the steady presence that trailed him silently. When they reached an old bridge, the human leaned against the railing, gazing at the glowing rivers below. He expected her to stay back, but she crept closer, standing beside him. Her thin arms wrapped around herself against the cold night air. "Why did you save me?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. No one ever has before. The human kept his eyes on the glowing waters. Because someone had to. Because what they did was wrong. She studied him in silence, her head tilting slightly. "But you don't even know me. What if I really was a thief?" He finally turned, his eyes steady on hers. "Then you'd have stolen something small, not life itself. They would have taken everything from you for a single piece of fruit. That's not justice. That's cruelty." Her lips parted, and for a moment she could not speak. No one had ever spoken for her like this. No one had ever given her words that felt like protection. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "Then I'll stay. I'll follow. I'll help, if you'll let me." The human almost smiled, though he quickly hid it. "Help, huh? We'll see." As they left the bridge and continued walking, the streets grew quieter. Lanterns dimmed, and the noise of the city faded into distant echoes. Still, her footsteps followed faithfully, soft and steady. She never walked beside him, always behind, like a shadow bound to his path. When they passed groups of people, she kept her head low, hiding behind his figure. And though he said nothing, he noticed. He noticed how she always stepped closer whenever others were near, how she leaned into his presence as though it was the only shield she had. By the time they reached the edges of the city, the human knew the truth. This girl was not going to leave. He could send her away 100 times, and she would still follow. She had chosen him, whether he liked it or not. And as the cold night stretched on, he realized something else. Deep down, he didn't want her to leave either. The human did not know what tomorrow would bring. Trouble, no doubt. But as he glanced back once more, he saw her eyes watching him, filled with fear. Yes, but also with a strange kind of hope. And in that moment, he understood that this was not the end of the story. This was the beginning. Days passed, and the city slowly forgot the marketplace scene. But the whispers about the human and the alien girl did not fade. Wherever they went, people stared. Some shook their heads, others muttered insults under their breath, and a few even spat on the ground as they walked by. To most of the city, she was still a thief, and he was still a fool for keeping her close. Yet the human noticed something that others could not. The girl, Lyra, never stole from him, never even asked for more than what little he could give. Instead, she seemed to spend every moment trying to repay him. When he returned from long walks through the city, he found fresh water in a pot by the door. When he woke in the morning, firewood was stacked neatly beside the small stove, though he never saw her carry it. His broken knife, which he had thought useless, was suddenly sharp again, the blade repaired with careful hands. She moved quietly, always in the background, as if afraid he would notice and push her away. Yet everything she did carried the same message. She wanted to prove she was worth the risk he had taken. One evening, while the wind howled through the narrow alleys, the human sat by the small fire inside his worn shelter. Lyra sat in the corner, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. For a long time she said nothing, but he could feel her watching him. At last, her voice broke the silence. "Why do they hate me?" she whispered. Her voice was so soft that he almost missed it. The human looked at her, seeing the glow of firelight dancing in her large eyes. "Because they don't see you," he said slowly. "They only see what they want to believe. A thief, a burden, someone to blame for their anger." Her head sank lower, her arms hugging herself tighter. "But I didn't take because I wanted to. I was starving. I was so hungry I thought I would die. No one would help me. No one would even look at me." Her words trembled as if each one was pulled from a wound that had not healed. "My clan, they're gone. Raiders burned everything. I ran. I hid. When I came here, I thought I could survive. But the people here, they hate my kind." The human leaned back, letting her words hang in the air. He had guessed as much, but hearing it from her made it heavier. She had not stolen out of greed. She had stolen to live, to see another sunrise. He looked at her again. Her thin frame curled tightly against the cold, and for the first time, he felt a sharp, sharp anger toward the city itself. Not at her. Never at her. "You don't have to explain to me," he said firmly. His tone made her lift her head in surprise. "I already knew." She blinked at him, confusion and hope mixing in her eyes. You believed me? Even before I told you?" He gave a small nod. "Hunger is not a crime. Fear is not a crime. They don't understand that. But I do." For a moment, silence filled the room again. Then her lips trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. She quickly wiped them with the back of her hand, ashamed to cry. "No one has ever said that to me before," she whispered. "They always said I was worthless, that my life meant nothing." The human shifted closer to the fire, his voice steady. "Then they were wrong." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling quickly, as though trying to hold back the storm of feelings building inside her. Slowly, carefully, she lowered her arms from around her knees. Her body still shook, but her face softened. For the first time since he met her, she looked less like a cornered animal and more like a person who dared to believe she had worth. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the human prepared to rest, he noticed her still sitting awake, her eyes on him. "You should sleep," he said gently. She shook her head, her voice quiet but filled with something new. "I'm not afraid anymore. Not when you're here." The human turned away, pretending not to hear the weight behind her words. But deep inside, he understood. To her, he was no longer just a stranger who had defended her once. He was her safety, her shield against the world, the only person who saw her as more than a thief. The next morning, he woke to find his small pack neatly arranged, his boots cleaned of the dust he had carried from the streets, and a piece of cloth mended with careful stitching. She moved silently, almost invisibly, but her touch was everywhere. She was building a place for herself, not with words, but with actions. And though he told himself he had only done a small thing for her, he knew the truth now. She was bound to him in ways neither of them could deny. She had given her trust, fragile and unbreakable, to the one person who had seen her differently. And as he watched her tend the fire with steady hands, he realized he had given something back to her as well. He had given her a reason to believe she was more than the name the city had thrown at her. In the quiet of that small shelter, with the storm outside fading into the distance, the human knew that what began in the marketplace was no longer just a passing act of kindness. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would tie them together in ways the world could not understand. The day was quiet when it began, but trouble often came when least expected. The human had left his small shelter to trade for food, leaving Lyra behind. She stayed near the fire, carefully cleaning the little space they shared, wanting to prove she was useful. She hummed softly to herself, a broken tune she half remembered from her childhood, when the sound of heavy footsteps filled the room. The door burst open. Neighbors from nearby houses stormed in, their eyes cold and full of anger. "There she is!" one shouted, pointing at her. "The thief hides here." Another grabbed her by the arm, yanking her up roughly. She cried out, struggling, but their grip was iron. They dragged her outside, ignoring her pleas, ignoring the tears in her wide eyes. In the street, more people waited. They accused her loudly, saying things had gone missing from their homes, even though no proof was shown. Their voices blended into a storm of hate. "You think you can trick us again?" one snarled. "We warned the human not to trust you. Now we will deal with you ourselves." Lyra shook her head desperately, her voice breaking. "I didn't steal. I swear I didn't." But her words meant nothing to them. In their eyes, she was guilty simply for existing. They bound her wrists with rough rope, ignoring her cries of pain. Some shouted that she should be sold to the guards. Others demanded she be cast out into the wild where no one would protect her. Fear gripped her heart as the mob dragged her through the dirt. She thought of the human, of how he had stood for her before, and her lips trembled with a whisper. "Please, come back." As if fate answered, the sound of heavy steps came from the end of the street. The human returned, carrying a small sack of food. His eyes widened as he saw the crowd gathered, their hands pulling Lyra toward the main square. He dropped the sack instantly, the bread scattering across the stones, and ran forward. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp with fury. "Let her go." The crowd turned to him, their faces twisted with self-righteous anger. "She's a thief," one shouted. "She was caught again," another added. "We won't let her trick you anymore, human. You may be blind, but we are not." The human pushed through them, forcing his way to her side. He saw her wrists bound tightly, her small frame shaking with fear. She looked up at him, tears streaking down her face. I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice broken. His jaw tightened. He didn't need proof. He believed her. He had seen the way she lived, the way she worked quietly in the shadows to repay him. She was no thief. Not anymore. He turned to the crowd, his voice thundering. "You lie. You have no evidence. You punish her because it is easy, because it makes you feel powerful. But you will not touch her again." Murmurs spread quickly, some shocked at his boldness. The man who held the rope sneered, jerking it tighter so that Lyra cried out in pain. "And what will you do, human? You're alone. She is nothing. Why risk yourself for her?" Without hesitation, the human stepped forward. His hand shot out and grabbed the rope, yanking it from the man's grip. In one swift motion, he tore the binding from her wrists. The crowd gasped. Lyra stumbled into him, clutching his arm, her whole body trembling with relief. "Because she is not nothing," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the square. "She is worth more than your hate, more than your lies." Anger erupted. Some in the crowd shouted threats, others raised their fists. The human moved, placing himself fully in front of her, his body a shield. His eyes burned with fury, daring any of them to step closer. "If you want her," he declared, his tone steady and cold, "you will have to go through me." The mob faltered. They saw the fire in his eyes, the way his muscles tensed as if ready for a fight. Whispers rippled through them. "Mad human," one muttered. "He'll bring ruin on himself," another hissed. But none dared to make the first move. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by Lyra's uneven breathing as she pressed against his back, clinging to the one person who stood for her. Finally, the leader of the mob spat on the ground. "You'll regret this. She'll betray you, just as she betrayed us." With that, they turned away one by one, their anger still heavy in the air, but their courage broken. Soon, only the human and Lyra remained in the street. Her wrists were raw from the rope, her eyes red from tears. He turned and knelt down, his hands gentle as he checked the marks. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, though her voice cracked. "They were going to sell me. I thought I'd never see you again." He wiped the dirt from her face, his eyes softening. "As long as I'm here, no one will take you." Her lips trembled, and suddenly she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He stiffened, surprised by the sudden closeness, but then he felt her shaking and slowly placed a hand on her back. She clung to him as if he were the only thing keeping her alive. From the shadows of nearby homes, a few eyes still watched, whispering curses, but none dared to act again. The human stood, keeping his arm around her as they walked back toward the shelter. Every step he took was heavy with the knowledge that he had just made more enemies. The city would not forgive him for this defiance. But as he glanced down at the fragile girl beside him, her grip tight on his arm, he knew he could not have done anything else. That night, as the fire crackled softly, Lyra sat close to him, her head resting against his shoulder. Her voice was weak but filled with gratitude. "You came back for me. You didn't let them take me." He looked into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Of course I did," he said simply. And in her heart, she knew. She was no longer alone. No matter how much the city hated her, no matter how many times they tried to cast her away, there was one person who would always stand in front of her, one person who believed she was worth protecting. And to her, that was everything. The night after the mob attack, the human knew they could no longer stay inside the city. The whispers had turned into open threats. People watched them too closely, and guards passed by his shelter more often than before, their eyes sharp and searching. He felt the danger pressing in like walls, closing around them. Lyra stayed quiet, her small frame trembling whenever she heard footsteps outside. He made the decision without telling her. They had to leave. Before dawn, he woke her gently. She blinked up at him, fear flashing in her eyes, as if she thought it was the mob again. But when she saw it was him, she let out a shaky breath. "We have to go," he said simply. She nodded without question, though her lips trembled. She trusted him now more than she trusted her own shadow. They slipped through the empty streets, moving quickly. The city was half asleep, lanterns dim, merchants still snoring in their stalls. But danger followed, even in silence. A guard spotted them as they passed an alley. His eyes narrowed. Then he shouted, "There they are!" The alarm spread fast. Boots thundered behind them, voices shouted orders, and the sound of weapons clanged in the dark. Lyra gasped, nearly stumbling as panic froze her legs. The human grabbed her hand and pulled. "Run!" he barked. They darted through twisting streets, their footsteps echoing. Lyra's breath came in short, painful gasps, but she held onto his hand like it was the only thing keeping her alive. The guards were close, their heavy boots pounding like drums. Torches lit up the night, casting long shadows ahead of them. The humans searched desperately for a way out. They turned into a narrow alley, hearts racing, but the way was blocked by a locked gate. Lyra whimpered, tears springing to her eyes. "We're trapped," she cried. The guards' voices grew louder, the glow of their torches filling the alley. The human clenched his jaw, scanning the gate. Without hesitation, he planted his shoulder against the rusted bars and shoved with all his strength. The metal groaned, bending under his weight. Lyra, trembling, pressed against it too, her small hands adding what little force she could. With a final push, the lock snapped, and the gate swung open. They stumbled through, just as the first guards turned the corner. The chase spilled into the outskirts of the city. The streets gave way to dirt roads, and then to the tall grass fields beyond the walls. Their lungs burned, their legs ached, but they kept running. Behind them, the city's anger followed. Shouts, torches, the glint of steel. The human never let go of Lyra's hand, pulling her forward when she faltered. Each time she stumbled, he caught her. Each time her knees buckled, he lifted her and pushed her on. At last, they reached the outer wall of the city. The stone loomed high above them, lit by flickering lanterns. Lyra's eyes widened in despair. "We can't climb that!" she cried, her voice breaking. But the human looked around quickly, spotting a broken section near an old watchtower where the stones had crumbled. He turned to her. "We don't have a choice." He cupped his hands and lifted her upward. She scrambled against the rough stone, her fingers bleeding as she tried to grip the cracks. "Don't look down," he said firmly. His voice steady, even as the sound of guards grew closer. She climbed higher, her breath ragged, until she reached the top. She turned, eyes wide, reaching for him. "Now you!" The guards burst into the field behind him, torches blazing. The human grabbed a jutting stone and began to climb. His muscles strained, his body aching, but he forced himself up, one pull at a time. Arrows whistled past, one striking the wall inches from his hand. Lyra cried out, stretching her arm down to him. "Hurry!" With a final push, he reached the top and grasped her hand. Together, they pulled him over just as the guards swarmed below. For a moment, the two of them sat on the wall, breathless, hearts pounding, staring at the dark fields beyond. Then he looked at her and nodded. "Jump!" They leapt down into the wild grass, rolling hard but alive. The torches flickered far above the wall, voices shouting angrily. But they were outside now, beyond the reach of the city. The night was cold, the fields wide and endless. For the first time, silence surrounded them. Lyra lay in the grass, gasping for breath. Tears streaked her dirty face, but her eyes glowed with relief. She turned to the human, her voice breaking. "You never let go of me, not once." He sat up slowly, staring back at the wall, then at her. "I told you," he said quietly. "I won't let them take you." Her small hand reached out, trembling, and grasped his sleeve. She did not let go even as exhaustion dragged her eyes closed. She fell asleep there, in the wild fields, her head resting close to him as though trusting that even in sleep, he would protect her. The human sat awake, listening to the night wind, watching the wall of the city glowing faintly under the lanterns. He knew they had escaped, but he also knew this was only the beginning. The city had marked them as enemies, and there would be no going back. Trouble would follow them wherever they went. But when he looked down at Lyra sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, he also knew he would never regret it. She had stumbled, fallen, nearly been caught, but she had never let go of his hand, and he had never let go of hers. They were bound now, Not by chains, but by choice, by trust, by survival. In the cold silence of the fields beyond the city, the human realized something that made his chest tighten. He was no longer just protecting her. He needed her too. The sun rose slowly over the wide fields, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and red. Dew clung to the grass, and the world felt quiet, almost peaceful. The human stretched his tired body, every muscle sore from the night before. He glanced at the small figure beside him. Lyra still slept close, her thin frame curled against his arm as though afraid the night would steal him away. Her face, usually tense with fear, looked different in sleep. Gentle, almost innocent. For a moment, he simply watched her, wondering how someone so fragile could survive a world so cruel. When she finally stirred, her eyes blinked open, and she found him watching her. Embarrassed, she sat up quickly, brushing her tangled hair from her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shy. "I didn't mean to stay so close." He shook his head. "You don't have to be sorry. You're safe now." Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak more, but she stayed quiet. Instead, she pulled her knees to her chest and stared at the horizon. For a long time, they sat there in silence, listening to the sounds of the waking world, birds calling, the rustle of the wind through the tall grass. But the silence carried weight. Both of them knew the city would not forget what had happened. Trouble was not behind them. It was ahead. As they walked through the fields that morning, Lyra stayed close to him, her steps quick whenever he lengthened his stride. Once, she reached for his sleeve, then quickly pulled her hand back, embarrassed. He noticed, but said nothing. He understood. She had been alone for so long that the idea of being left again was unbearable. Later, when they stopped by a stream to drink, Lyra knelt on the bank, her reflection rippling in the water. She touched the bruises on her wrists where the rope had cut into her skin. Her voice was low, almost like she was speaking to herself. "They'll never stop hating me. No matter what I do, I'll always be a thief to them." The human crouched beside her, splashing cool water on his face. "Maybe," he admitted, his tone honest. "But you don't need them. You're not theirs anymore." She looked at him, her eyes wide. "Then, whose am I?" He paused, staring at the stream. Slowly, he lifted his head and met her gaze. "You're with me now, and that's enough." Her lips parted as if she didn't know how to answer. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. She turned her face away quickly, afraid to let him see, but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. For the first time, she felt she belonged somewhere. Not to a city that despised her, not to a mob that wanted her gone, but to him. That night, they made camp near the edge of the forest. The fire crackled softly, casting light over their faces. Lyra sat close, the warmth easing the cold from her bones. She studied him when he wasn't looking, the strength in his hands, the calm in his eyes. At last, she whispered, "Why? Why do you keep helping me? You've lost so much because of me. You could have left me in the market. You could have walked away when the mob came. Why didn't you?" The human was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked into the fire. "Because I've been alone too," he said softly. "I know what it feels like when no one stands for you. And I swore I'd never let someone else suffer that way if I could stop it." Her breath caught and her chest tightened. She leaned closer, her voice unsteady. "Then I won't leave. Not ever. Even if the whole world calls me a thief, I'll stay by your side." He turned to her, studying her face lit by the firelight. She meant every word. She was not saying it out of fear now, but out of choice. A bond had formed between them, stronger than chains, stronger than the hate of an entire city. The following days were hard. They had little food, no real shelter, and the land beyond the city was full of dangers. But they faced it together. When Lyra stumbled, the human caught her. When he grew tired, she carried what little she could to ease his burden. They laughed once, quietly, when she slipped in the mud and landed in the stream, her squeal breaking the heavy silence they had carried for so long. It was the first sound of joy either of them had known in many weeks. Each night by the fire, Lyra told him more of her past, her clan, her escape, the long days of hunger and fear. And each night he listened without judgment, his steady presence giving her the courage to speak. And though he rarely spoke of himself, she began to see the loneliness in him too. They were different, yet the same. Two lives broken by cruelty, now pieced together by chance and choice. One evening, as the stars spread across the sky, Lyra lay beside the fire, her eyes heavy with sleep. She whispered softly, "I used to dream someone would come for me, but dreams always ended before they did. Now you're here, and I don't want to wake up." The human looked at her, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt the truth of her words. She was no longer just the girl from the market, no longer just the thief everyone hated. She was his companion, his shadow, his family. He knew the world would not forgive them. The city might hunt them, strangers might call them names, but it no longer mattered, because she had chosen him, and he had chosen her. And in a galaxy full of cruelty and hate, that choice was worth more than anything. As the fire crackled low and the night grew deep, Lyra reached for his arm, her touch gentle but certain. "I won't leave your side," she whispered again, her eyes closing. And this time, he did not hide his answer. He placed his hand over hers and said quietly, "Then neither will I." In that moment, beneath the endless stars, the thief and the human were no longer strangers bound by chance. They were something far greater, two souls who had found in each other what the world had tried to deny them: trust, dignity, and the strength to face whatever came next, together.